Dad.
Did we do something wrong?
Marcus Hale stood in the center of the bank lobby, with one hand resting lightly on his daughter's shoulder. The room had fallen so silent that even the soft hum of the ceiling vents seemed too loud. A torn deposit slip drifted across the polished marble floor before coming to rest beside a pair of worn work boots streaked with engine grease. Across from him, bank manager Richard Collins adjusted his expensive tie and gave a slow, dismissive shake of his head, convinced he had already won. Two uniformed security officers closed in from either side, while customers reached for their phones, sensing something unusual was about to unfold. 8-year-old Emma Hale tightened her grip on her father's calloused hand. Her small voice barely carried above a whisper. "Dad, did we do something wrong?" Marcus looked down at her, his weathered face calm, despite the dozens of eyes fixed upon him. There was no anger in his expression, only quiet disappointment. He squeezed her hand gently before looking back at Collins. "No, sweetheart," he said softly. "We came here to do the right thing." Collins laughed under his breath. "Then you'll have no problem leaving." Marcus gave a single nod, as though he had expected those words all along. Somewhere in the back office, a young employee stared at a document she had just uncovered, her face draining of color as one name leaped from the page. Marcus Hale. The name was printed beside a number so large, she read it 3 times before believing it. She looked toward the lobby, where security had nearly reached him, and whispered, "Oh, they have no idea who they're asking to leave." But to understand how a quiet mechanic, carrying only $5 into a small-town Texas bank, became the most important man in the building, it helps to go back 3 weeks earlier, long before anyone whispered his name with respect. Marcus Hale lived in a modest white house at the edge of Willow Creek, Texas. The paint along the porch railing had begun to peel beneath years of relentless summer heat, and one section of the front steps creaked every time someone climbed them. Marcus had promised Emma he would fix it once business slowed down, though business never truly slowed, because it had never truly recovered. Every morning before sunrise, the old alarm clock beside his bed buzzed exactly once before Marcus reached over and silenced it. Years of discipline had trained him to wake before the sound even finished. He would sit quietly for a few moments, looking toward the framed photograph resting on the nightstand. It showed his late wife, Sarah Hale, smiling beneath a wide Texas sky during a county fair, almost 10 years earlier. Emma had inherited Sarah's eyes. Marcus still found himself speaking softly to the photograph before every workday. "We're doing okay," he would say. "I'm keeping my promise." He never asked for anything in return. Down the hallway, Emma's room was filled with drawings taped unevenly across pale blue walls. Crayon horses, homemade birthday cards, pictures of her parents holding hands beneath oversized yellow suns. Marcus knocked gently every morning before opening the door. "Rise and shine, bug." Emma always answered the same way, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "5 more minutes?" Marcus smiled every single time. "That's what you said yesterday, and it almost worked." He laughed quietly before pulling open the curtains and letting warm morning light spill across the room. They shared breakfast together every day, no matter how tight money became. Sometimes scrambled eggs, sometimes toast with homemade jam given by an elderly neighbor. When the bills piled too high, breakfast became oatmeal, sweetened with cinnamon because sugar cost less than syrup. Emma never complained. Instead, she would slide half her bowl toward her father. "I'm not that hungry." Marcus always slid it back. "Growing girls need fuel. Mechanics do too. I've got enough." She usually knew he didn't, but she also knew arguing never changed his mind. After breakfast, they climbed into Marcus's faded blue pickup truck. The driver's seat had been patched twice with duct tape, and the air conditioner had stopped working years ago, but the engine still purred with dependable confidence, because Marcus refused to neglect a machine that carried his daughter safely every day. On the drive to school, they played a simple game. Emma searched for red trucks while Marcus counted old oak trees. Whoever spotted 21st chose dinner. Emma almost always won because Marcus secretly ignored obvious trees just to hear her celebrate. "Spaghetti tonight," she'd cheer. "Guess I better start boiling water." He dropped her at Willow Creek Elementary every morning. Before she climbed out, Emma performed the same ritual. She pressed 2 fingers gently against the silver wedding band Marcus still wore. "For Mom," she whispered. Then she hugged him tightly before running toward school. Marcus watched until she disappeared through the doors. Only then did he drive across town to Hale Auto Repair. The garage had once belonged to his father. The sign above the entrance had faded from bright red to dusty pink after decades beneath the Texas sun. Inside, the shop smelled of oil, steel, and old memories. Marcus preferred it that way. He believed honest work should leave honest marks. Customers trusted him because he never invented repairs. If replacing a $20 hose solved the problem, he never charged for an unnecessary engine overhaul. Word spread slowly through small towns, but integrity spread even slower. It took years to build and only moments to lose. Business remained steady enough to survive, but never enough to thrive. During lunch, Marcus always carried the same dented metal lunchbox. Most mechanics brought large coolers. Marcus carried the lunchbox Sarah had given him during their first anniversary. The paint had chipped away around the edges, revealing bare steel beneath. He had opportunities to replace it many times. He never did. One afternoon, a delivery driver watched Marcus repair an elderly widow's truck without charging labor. "You're running a business," the driver said. "Not a charity." Marcus simply wiped grease from his hands. "She needs groceries more than I need another invoice." The driver shook his head, unable to understand. Marcus returned quietly to work. Hidden beneath the driver's seat of his pickup rested an old leather folder, cracked with age, and secured by a brass clasp, polished smooth through years of careful handling. Every Friday, after closing the garage, Marcus removed it for only a few moments. He checked that everything inside remained exactly where it belonged before locking it away again. No one had ever seen what the folder contained. Emma asked once, "Is it treasure?" Marcus smiled thoughtfully. "In a way. Can I see it?" "Someday." "When?" Marcus looked toward the fading sunset stretching across the Texas horizon. "When it's time." Emma accepted the answer because she trusted her father completely. She never knew that the folder represented a promise made years earlier, one that connected a struggling mechanic to a world far larger than anyone in Willow Creek could imagine. Across town, the impressive limestone building housing Willow Regional Bank reflected the evening sun like polished gold. Customers admired its grand entrance without realizing that one man who drove past it almost every evening held more influence over its future than every executive working inside combined. Marcus never looked toward the building, at least not for very long. He simply kept driving home to the little white house where an 8-year-old girl waited on the porch every evening with a smile bright enough to make every sacrifice worthwhile. Neither of them knew that in only 3 weeks, that quiet routine would collide with pride, power, and a single $5 deposit that would change far more than a bank account. It would reveal the true worth of a man everyone believed they had already measured. The first hints appeared on an ordinary Monday, the kind of day that never makes headlines but quietly reveals what people believe about one another. Marcus Hale unlocked the doors to Hale Auto Repair just before 7. The morning air still carried the coolness of dawn, but the Texas heat was already waiting beyond the horizon. He rolled up the garage doors, switched on the lights, and listened as the familiar sounds of the shop came alive. Air compressors, metal tools settling into place, the comforting rhythm of honest work. By 8 o'clock, 3 customers had already arrived. The 4th came in, driving a luxury SUV that gleamed so brightly it reflected every inch of the cracked pavement outside. The owner, dressed in pressed golf clothes and polished loafers, stepped out while talking loudly on his phone. He barely glanced at Marcus. "Just make it quick," he said. tossing the keys across the counter without waiting to see if Marcus caught them. The keys slid off the edge and clattered onto the concrete floor. Marcus bent down, picked them up, and placed them carefully on the counter. "I'll take a look and give you a call before I repair anything." The man finally looked at Marcus's grease-stained shirt and smiled with quiet contempt. "Just don't make it worse." Marcus simply nodded. By late afternoon, the repair was finished. The problem had been nothing more than a loose sensor connection. Marcus charged less than half of what the nearest dealership would have billed. When the customer returned, he looked at the invoice twice. "That's it?" Marcus nodded. "That's all it needed." The man frowned. "You sure you didn't miss something?" Marcus smiled politely. "I'd rather lose money than your trust." The customer walked away without saying thank you. Moments like that happened more often than Marcus admitted. They never made him angry anymore. They simply reminded him that many people judged a man long before they learned his character. Later that afternoon, Marcus drove to Willow Creek Elementary to pick up Emma. Children poured through the front doors, laughing and shouting, while parents gathered along the sidewalk. Emma spotted her father immediately and ran toward him with a wide smile, her backpack bouncing behind her. Before she reached him, another parent standing nearby spoke just loudly enough for others to hear. "Looks like somebody forgot to wash up before coming to school." A few people chuckled politely. Marcus looked down at his hands. Despite washing them twice before leaving the garage, traces of black grease still rested beneath his fingernails. Some stains became part of the skin after years of labor. Emma heard the comment too. She slowed for only a second before taking her father's hand. "Dad fixes things," she said proudly. "That's why his hands look like that." The woman offered an awkward smile, but said nothing else. Marcus squeezed Emma's hand gently as they walked toward the truck. "You didn't have to say anything." Emma looked up at him. "Yes, I did." He smiled. "Why?" "Because you're always standing up for me." Those simple words stayed with Marcus the entire drive home. The following Saturday brought Willow Creek's annual community picnic in the town square. Folding tables filled the park beneath strings of colorful flags, while local businesses sponsored games for children. Marcus volunteered every year to repair bicycles free of charge. He sat beneath a canvas tent with a toolbox beside him, tightening chains, replacing brake cables, and adjusting handlebars for families who couldn't afford a repair shop. Across the lawn, Willow Regional Bank had set up an elaborate booth complete with balloons, catered refreshments, and polished promotional banners celebrating its commitment to the community. Richard Collins stood near the entrance, greeting local business owners with broad smiles and firm handshakes. He wore an expensive navy suit despite the summer heat, and carried himself like someone who believed the town revolved around his approval. Whenever cameras appeared, Richard somehow managed to stand directly in front of them. Marcus noticed him only in passing. Richard did not notice Marcus at all, until Emma wandered toward the bank's booth after finishing an art contest. A young employee handed her a blue balloon with the bank's logo printed across it. Emma thanked her politely and hurried back toward her father. Before she reached the repair tent, a gust of wind pulled the balloon free. It floated directly toward Richard Collins, who caught the string before it escaped into the sky. Emma ran up, smiling. "Excuse me, mister. That's mine." Richard looked down at her, then toward Marcus, walking over from the repair station in stained work clothes. Without asking any questions, Richard handed the balloon to another child standing nearby, whose parents happened to be longtime banking clients. "Here you go, son." Emma stopped walking. But the little boy accepted the balloon happily, while his parents thanked Richard for the kind gesture. Marcus arrived beside Emma, just as Richard dusted invisible lint from his jacket. "There was a misunderstanding," Marcus said calmly. Richard glanced at the faded logo on Marcus's work shirt before answering. "It's just a balloon." Emma looked at the ground. Marcus rested a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Come on, sweetheart." They walked away without another word. Halfway across the park, an elderly woman who had watched the exchange tied a fresh red balloon to Emma's wrist. "Some things belong with the right people," she whispered. Emma smiled again, but Marcus noticed something different. For the first time, she had seen someone dismiss her father simply because of how he looked. That evening, Marcus balanced the household checkbook at the kitchen table. Bills were arranged in careful stacks: mortgage, utilities, insurance, school supplies, auto parts. Every dollar already had a purpose before it reached his hands. Emma sat nearby coloring while soft rain tapped against the windows. Marcus counted the cash remaining in his wallet. $5. He placed the bill on top of a small envelope addressed to Willow Regional Bank. Emma looked over. "Is that all?" Marcus nodded. "For today. Is it enough?" Marcus folded the envelope carefully. Sometimes doing the right thing isn't about the amount. Emma tilted her head. "Then why take it?" Marcus looked thoughtfully toward the window where rain blurred the streetlights outside. "Because promises don't depend on convenience." She accepted the answer, even though she didn't fully understand it. Before going to bed, Marcus opened the old leather folder one more time. Inside rested several documents, yellowed with age, along with a single fountain pen wrapped in soft cloth. He ran one thumb across the pen before returning everything exactly as he had found it. His eyes paused briefly on a signature near the bottom of one document. Then he closed the folder, locked it away, and turned off the light. Monday morning arrived with gray skies and steady rain. Marcus dropped Emma at school as always. Before climbing out of the truck, she reached into her backpack and pulled out a small folded note. "What's this?" Marcus asked. "Don't read it until later." He slipped it into his shirt pocket and smiled. Deal. At lunchtime, he finally unfolded the paper. Written in careful second-grade handwriting were only 7 words. "You're the best dad in the whole world." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment. He folded the note neatly and placed it beside Sarah's old wedding photograph inside his wallet. Then he looked across the garage at the stack of unpaid invoices waiting on his desk. Business had been slower than expected. One customer still owed nearly $3,000. Another had delayed payment for over 60 days. The bank required a small monthly account deposit to keep one of his long-standing business agreements active. It wasn't much. Just $5 would satisfy the requirement, until a larger payment cleared later that week. Marcus washed his hands, changed into a clean work shirt, picked up the envelope containing the $5 bill, and climbed into his aging pickup. As he drove toward Willow Regional Bank, neither he nor Emma could possibly know that, before the afternoon was over, those $5 would become the most expensive mistake Richard Collins had ever made. Marcus parked his faded blue pickup beneath the lone oak tree across from Willow Regional Bank and sat quietly for a moment before stepping out. Rain from earlier had left the sidewalks shining beneath the afternoon sun. He reached across the passenger seat and picked up the small white envelope containing the $5 bill. It looked insignificant, thin, ordinary, yet Marcus handled it with the same care he gave every promise he intended to keep. Before closing the truck door, he noticed Emma's folded note still tucked inside his shirt pocket. He smiled to himself, touched it lightly, and walked toward the bank. The limestone building towered above Main Street, its polished glass doors reflecting expensive cars parked along the curb. Men in tailored suits hurried inside carrying leather briefcases, while customers dressed in business attire exchanged polite greetings with employees who knew them by name. Marcus paused, only long enough to wipe his boots carefully on the entrance mat. He disliked bringing dirt into any building, especially one that didn't belong to him. The moment he stepped inside, conversations seemed to shift around him. No one openly stared, but several pairs of eyes drifted toward the grease stains that remained around his fingernails, despite repeated washing. His clean denim shirt had been ironed that morning, yet years of hard work had permanently faded its color. He looked less like someone visiting a bank than someone there to repair an air conditioner. Richard Collins spotted him almost immediately from his office, overlooking the lobby. Through the glass walls, Richard watched Marcus approach the teller line with the quiet confidence of someone who didn't realize he was out of place. Richard adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit before stepping onto the banking floor. His assistant hurried behind him, carrying a digital tablet. "Good afternoon," the teller said warmly as Marcus reached the counter. Her name tag read, Melissa Grant. She smiled with genuine kindness. "How can I help you today?" Marcus placed the envelope gently on the counter. "I'd like to make a deposit into my business account, please." Melissa opened the envelope and glanced inside before looking back at her computer screen. 5.00? Marcus nodded. "That's right." She entered the account number and hesitated for only a second. "One moment, please." Richard had already begun walking toward them. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice carrying across the lobby. Melissa looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Collins, this customer is making a deposit." Richard's eyes settled on the single $5 bill resting on the counter. For a moment, he simply stared at it. Then, a slow smile appeared. "You're holding up the line. For $5? Several customers turned to look. Marcus answered calmly, "It's an account deposit." Richard chuckled loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Sir, people behind you have actual banking to do." Marcus didn't move. "It'll only take a moment." Richard folded his arms. "Do you honestly expect this institution to process a $5 deposit in the middle of the business day?" Melissa shifted nervously. "Company policy requires us to accept all deposits." Richard cut her off without looking away from Marcus. "I'm aware of company policy." The line behind Marcus continued growing. Some customers sighed impatiently, though none knew what was happening. Others simply watched. Richard leaned closer. "What kind of business are you running?" Marcus answered honestly. "Auto repair." Richard glanced at Marcus's work boots before smirking. "Business must be booming." A few uncomfortable laughs came from the waiting line. Marcus remained perfectly still. Some months are harder than others. Richard nodded, as though proving a point. Clearly. Melissa quietly reached for the deposit slip, hoping to finish the transaction before things became worse. Richard stopped her with a raised hand. "No." She looked surprised. "Sir." Richard lifted the $5 bill between two fingers, as though it were something unpleasant. "This isn't a charity collection box." Marcus met his eyes. "It's a deposit." Richard smiled thinly. "No, it's an inconvenience." The lobby had grown almost completely silent now. Even conversations at nearby desks had stopped. Employees pretended to organize paperwork while secretly watching. Richard held the bill in the air another moment before letting it fall back onto the counter. "Tell me something, mister." He glanced toward the account information on Melissa's screen. "Hale." Marcus gave a slight nod. "When was the last time you had more than $5 to put into this account?" Marcus answered without hesitation. "That's personal." Richard laughed again. "No, it's obvious." He stepped back and addressed the room more loudly than necessary. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly why banks have minimum standards. Otherwise,
What if I told you that a man was publicly humiliated over a simple $5 bank deposit? But no one in that room knew he quietly owned the very bank they were standing in. Marcus Hale was just a widowed mechanic trying to teach his 8-year-old daughter an important lesson about honesty and dignity. Instead, a powerful bank manager mocked him, tore up his deposit slip, and had security escort him out in front of everyone. But appearances can be dangerously misleading. What happened next didn't involve shouting or revenge. It involved truth, accountability, and a secret that would change the lives of everyone inside that bank. This is a powerful story about respect, character, and why you should never judge someone by the clothes they wear or the size of their bank deposit. Watch this story all the way to the end. You won't believe how it unfolds. And if you enjoy inspiring stories where dignity wins over arrogance, don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us for more unforgettable dad stories.
Every person with pocket change expects executive attention. The words landed heavily across the lobby. Melissa looked visibly embarrassed. Another teller lowered his eyes toward his keyboard. An elderly customer quietly shook his head. Richard picked up the deposit slip, looked at it for less than a second, then slowly tore it in half. The sound echoed through the silent room. He dropped both pieces onto the polished marble floor, directly in front of Marcus. "There," Richard smiled. "Transaction complete. Several customers gasped softly. Melissa stared in disbelief. Sir, she whispered. Richard ignored her. Now if you'll excuse us, there are clients here conducting serious business. Marcus looked down at the torn pieces, without bending to pick them up. For several long seconds, no one moved. Then the front doors opened. Emma Hale stepped inside. She had forgotten her lunchbox at school, and the secretary had called Marcus just before dismissal. Since the school sat only a few blocks away, Marcus had planned to meet her afterward, before returning to work. Emma spotted her father immediately. "Dad!" She smiled until she noticed every eye in the room fixed on him. Then she saw the torn paper on the floor, and the $5 bill still lying on the counter. Her smile disappeared. She walked quietly to Marcus's side and slipped her small hand into his. Calloused fingers wrapped gently around hers. Richard looked briefly annoyed. "Sir, this is a place of business." Emma looked up at Marcus. "What's happening?" For a brief moment, Marcus said nothing. He could have explained everything. He could have argued. He could have reminded Richard that every customer deserved respect, regardless of balance. Instead, he looked down at his daughter and smiled softly. "Nothing we'll remember forever." Then he looked back at Richard Collins. "May I have my deposit back, please?" Richard stared at him as though unable to believe the request. "You're serious?" Marcus nodded once. "Yes." Richard picked up the $5 bill again. He held it between two fingers before extending it toward Marcus. At the last second, he released it deliberately. The bill fluttered through the air before landing near Marcus's boots. A few people visibly flinched. Emma looked down at the floor, then back up at Richard. She had never seen an adult treat her father that way. Marcus slowly bent down, picked up the bill, smoothed its folded edges carefully with both hands, and placed it back inside the envelope. His movements were unhurried, precise, controlled. When he stood again, he looked directly at Richard. "Thank you." Richard frowned. "That's all you have to say?" Marcus nodded. "Yes." Richard shook his head in disbelief. "Then leave." Marcus placed one hand gently on Emma's shoulder. "We'll go." Richard pointed toward the entrance. Security. Two uniformed officers stationed near the front desk exchanged uncertain glances before approaching. Neither appeared eager to intervene. "Escort them outside." One of the officers cleared his throat. "Sir, he isn't causing any disturbance." Richard's expression hardened. That was an instruction. Reluctantly, the officers stopped a respectful distance from Marcus. "Mr. Hale," one said quietly, "would you come with us?" Marcus smiled kindly. "Of course." Emma looked up at him. "Dad, did we do something wrong?" The question settled over the lobby like a heavy weight. Even Richard looked away for a fraction of a second. Marcus knelt until he was eye level with his daughter. "No, sweetheart." His voice remained steady. "Sometimes people only see what's on the outside. That's not their greatest mistake. Their greatest mistake is deciding they already know the whole story." Emma nodded slowly, though tears had begun filling her eyes. Marcus stood, took her hand once more, and turned toward the doors. As they walked through the silent lobby, no one spoke. An elderly veteran removed his cap in quiet respect. A young mother lowered her eyes, ashamed she had watched without saying anything. Melissa Grant stood frozen behind her station, unable to shake the feeling that something terribly wrong had just happened. She watched Marcus disappear through the glass entrance, with his daughter beside him. Then she looked back at the account still open on her computer screen. A small notification had appeared in the corner of the monitor. She frowned. The account contained restrictions she had never seen before. There was a notation requiring executive authorization for any account changes. Another line referenced confidential ownership documents stored only in the executive archive. Melissa's heartbeat quickened. She clicked the internal file, but the screen immediately displayed a message. "Access denied. Board-level authorization required." She whispered to herself. Why would a mechanic's business account need board-level authorization? Behind the glass walls of his office, Richard Collins had already dismissed the incident as another unpleasant interruption. He had no idea that within the hour, One forgotten document, one curious employee, and one phone call would begin unraveling everything he believed he controlled. Melissa Grant tried returning to work, but the message on her screen refused to leave her thoughts. She had worked at Willow Regional Bank for nearly 6 years. During that time, she had opened hundreds of business accounts, processed thousands of deposits, and learned that ordinary accounts never carried board-level restrictions. Those were reserved for people whose identities required extraordinary confidentiality. Yet the quiet mechanic who had just been escorted from the building had arrived with a worn pickup truck, grease beneath his fingernails, and only $5 to deposit. None of it made sense. She looked toward Richard Collins's office. He was already laughing with 2 commercial clients, acting as though nothing unusual had happened. Melissa glanced back at the computer, lowered her voice, and called the bank's internal records department. Archives. Melissa hesitated. Hi, this is Melissa, at the Main Street branch. I'm trying to verify an executive account restriction, the clerk answered casually. Account number? Melissa read the number from Marcus's file. There was a pause, long enough to become uncomfortable. Then the clerk spoke again, but his tone had completely changed. Where did you get this account? Melissa frowned. It's here at my station. Another pause. Don't touch anything. Melissa blinked. Excuse me. The clerk lowered his voice. That file hasn't been accessed in years. Hold, please. The line went silent. Seconds later, another voice came on. Older, sharper. This is Harold Benson, Director of Corporate Records. Who is requesting access? Melissa repeated her name. Why are you in that file? Melissa swallowed. The customer came in to make a deposit. Silence. Mr. Hale came in personally. Melissa nodded instinctively before realizing he couldn't see her. Yes, sir. Harold's next question came almost as a whisper. Is he still there? Melissa looked toward the entrance where Marcus and Emma had disappeared minutes earlier. No. Who handled him? Melissa closed her eyes. Mr. Collins. Nothing. The silence stretched so long, Melissa wondered if the call had disconnected. Then Harold spoke only 4 words. I'll be there. The call ended. Within 30 seconds, Harold Benson was already dialing another number several counties away. The phone rang twice. This is Thomas Whitaker. Harold didn't waste a second. Tom, Marcus Hale just walked into the Willow Creek branch. The man on the other end stopped speaking entirely. Finally, he asked, Did he sign anything? Harold answered, No. Then why were you notified? Harold looked through the office window toward Richard Collins. Because our branch manager threw him out. Complete silence followed. Then Thomas Whitaker spoke in a tone Harold had never heard before. I'm leaving now. Thomas Whitaker had served on Willow Regional Bank's board of directors for almost 30 years. He had known Marcus since Marcus was barely older than Emma. Very few people still remembered those days. Fewer still knew why Marcus's name had been deliberately hidden from nearly every employee in the company. Thomas reached his car in less than a minute. The drive from Dallas would take nearly 3 hours. He never questioned whether the trip was necessary. Back inside the branch, Richard Collins congratulated himself on restoring what he called professionalism. He stood outside his office, speaking with assistant manager Denise Carter. Some people need to understand appearances matter, Richard said. Denise shifted uneasily. He wasn't causing trouble. Richard shrugged. Neither does someone who walks into a luxury dealership asking to buy a private jet. Denise looked uncomfortable. It was only $5. Richard smiled. Exactly. Neither noticed Melissa quietly listening from the teller stations. Her stomach tightened. She had never heard Richard sound so proud of humiliating another person. Just after 4 o'clock, an unfamiliar black sedan stopped outside the bank. A man wearing a tailored gray suit stepped inside, carrying a leather briefcase. He introduced himself politely. Good afternoon. Daniel Foster, Internal Compliance Division. Richard smiled immediately. Mr. Foster, we weren't expecting an inspection. Daniel returned the smile. Neither were we. He handed Richard official identification. Routine review. Richard relaxed. Of course. Whatever you need. Daniel looked around the lobby before asking a single question. Where is Mr. Marcus Hale? Richard laughed lightly. You just missed him. Daniel's expression never changed. Did you process his transaction? Richard folded his arms. There wasn't much of one. Daniel waited. Richard continued. $5 deposit. Complete waste of everyone's time. Daniel remained perfectly still. Did you accept it? Richard smiled confidently. No. Daniel wrote one sentence inside a notebook. Reason? Richard shrugged. Managerial discretion. Daniel looked up slowly. Show me the written policy that authorizes managerial discretion to refuse a lawful deposit. Richard's smile faded slightly. Well, it's implied. Daniel closed the notebook. Nothing in banking law is implied. For the first time that afternoon, Richard felt a small knot forming in his stomach. Daniel spent the next 45 minutes quietly reviewing security footage, transaction logs, and employee statements. He asked very few questions. The fewer he asked, the more nervous Richard became. Melissa described everything exactly as it happened. She omitted nothing. When Daniel finished interviewing her, he simply thanked her for her honesty. Shortly before closing time, Daniel requested one final item. Please retrieve Executive Archive Box 27. Richard frowned. Why? Daniel looked directly at him. Because that's where Mr. Hale's ownership records are stored. The words meant nothing to Richard at first. Ownership? Daniel nodded. Correct. Richard laughed once. There must be some mistake, Daniel answered calmly. There usually isn't. Richard led him downstairs into the secure archive room. Only branch managers possessed access cards for the reinforced steel door. Inside, rows of locked filing cabinets stretched across the climate-controlled room. Daniel stopped in front of cabinet 27. Please. Richard unlocked it. Daniel removed a thick blue folder marked Confidential, Founding Trust. He opened it carefully. Richard leaned forward. Then he saw the first page. His smile disappeared. The document listed the original founders of Willow Regional Bank. Several names had been crossed out over decades of mergers, inheritances, and restructuring. At the bottom remained one active trust, Hale Family Holdings. Richard frowned. I've never seen this. Daniel continued turning pages. Stock certificates, board resolutions, legal amendments, trust agreements. Then came the final page. Richard stared as though unable to understand what he was reading. Majority controlling interest, 51%. Current beneficiary, Marcus Jonathan Hale. Richard's mouth went dry. No! Daniel looked at him steadily. Yes! Richard shook his head. The mechanic? Daniel closed the folder. The majority owner. Richard took one step backward until he bumped into the filing cabinet behind him. That's impossible, Daniel answered quietly. Your opinion doesn't change corporate law. Richard's breathing became shallow. Why didn't anyone tell me? Daniel replied. Because Mr. Hale requested anonymity after his wife died. He never wanted preferential treatment. He instructed the board that every employee should treat him exactly like every other customer. Richard whispered, Oh God. Daniel nodded once. Most managers spent their entire careers never meeting him. Richard remembered the torn deposit slip, the $5 bill floating onto the floor, security walking toward Emma, the little girl's question, Dad, did we do something wrong? His face turned pale. Can we call him? Daniel looked toward the folder. You can try. Richard reached immediately for his phone. His hands trembled as he dialed the number listed in the records. No answer. He called again. Voicemail. He looked at Daniel. I'll go to his house. Daniel stopped him. No. Richard stared. Please. Daniel spoke with quiet authority. If Mr. Hale wants to speak with you, he'll contact you. Richard lowered the phone slowly. For the first time in his career, the confident bank manager understood what real uncertainty felt like. But what Richard Collins still didn't know was that the humiliation in the lobby had already reached every member of the board of directors. And before the next business day began, a special emergency meeting would be called. The agenda contained only one item, Richard Collins, The emergency meeting notice arrived in every board member's inbox before sunrise. It contained only 9 words beneath the subject line: mandatory attendance, executive session, 8 a.m. sharp. No explanation followed. No agenda beyond a single name. Richard Collins. Richard barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Marcus bending down to retrieve the $5 bill from the marble floor. He heard Emma's quiet voice asking whether they had done something wrong. By dawn, he had convinced himself there had been some misunderstanding that could still be corrected. He arrived at the bank nearly an hour early, hoping to gather documents that might justify his actions. Instead, he found Daniel Foster already waiting in the boardroom with several sealed folders stacked neatly before him. "Good morning," Richard said, attempting confidence. Daniel looked up briefly. "Morning." Nothing more. Richard took his usual seat at the far end of the polished walnut table. One by one, the directors entered, without exchanging their normal greetings. Thomas Whitaker arrived last. His silver hair was damp from the morning rain, and the expression on his face carried the weight of disappointment rather than anger. He had spent 3 decades helping guide the institution through recessions, mergers, and lawsuits. He had never looked as tired as he did now. At precisely 8 o'clock, the doors closed. Thomas folded his hands. "We'll begin." The corporate secretary activated the recording system required for official board proceedings. Executive session number 341 is now in order. Thomas looked directly at Richard. "Mr. Collins, before we discuss policy, I'd like to ask a simple question." Richard straightened in his chair. "Of course. Yesterday, did Marcus Hale personally visit your branch?" Richard swallowed. "Yes." "Did he attempt to make a lawful deposit?" Richard nodded. "Yes." "Did you refuse that deposit?" Richard hesitated only briefly. "Yes." Thomas allowed several seconds of silence. "Why?" Richard took a careful breath. "I believed the transaction disrupted operations. I exercised what I thought was sound managerial judgment." Daniel slid a folder across the table. Exhibit 1. Inside were printed photographs taken from the security cameras. Marcus standing quietly at the teller window. Richard holding the $5 bill between 2 fingers. The torn deposit slip. Emma walking into the lobby. Security approaching father and daughter. Finally, Marcus kneeling before Emma while customers watched in silence. No one spoke as the photographs passed around the table. Richard felt each page becoming heavier than the last. Then Daniel opened a laptop and played the surveillance video. The room filled with the sounds Richard wished he could erase. His own laughter, his own voice mocking the deposit, the unmistakable sound of paper tearing. Then Emma's question. "Dad, did we do something wrong?" When the recording ended, Thomas quietly closed the laptop. "Do you know why Mr. Hale owns 51% of this bank?" Richard shook his head. "No, sir." Thomas stood and walked toward the large photograph hanging on the boardroom wall. It showed the bank's founders standing in front of the original brick building nearly 60 years earlier. He pointed to one man in the center, Jonathan Hale, Marcus's grandfather. The directors listened as Thomas continued. During the financial crisis, 32 years ago, this bank was 48 hours away from permanent closure. Every major investor walked away, except one family. Jonathan Hale mortgaged nearly everything he owned to keep payroll running. Employees kept their jobs because of him. Farmers kept their loans. Small businesses survived because one man believed this town deserved another chance. Thomas looked back toward Richard. When Jonathan died, Marcus's father inherited the controlling interest. When his father passed away, Marcus became majority owner, while still in his 20s. Richard listened without speaking. Then Marcus's wife became ill. Thomas's voice softened. After Sarah died, Marcus asked this board for one favor. He didn't want special treatment. He wanted to know whether the bank his family had protected still believed every customer deserved dignity. He visited branches quietly over the years, sometimes with large deposits, sometimes with almost nothing. No manager ever knew when he might walk through the door. Richard lowered his eyes. Until yesterday, Thomas nodded. Until yesterday, no one raised their voice. The disappointment inside the room was far more powerful than anger. Daniel opened another folder. Exhibit 2. It contained employee statements. Melissa described the humiliation exactly as she witnessed it. The elderly veteran submitted a written account after learning who Marcus was. Even one of the security officers filed a statement, admitting Marcus had remained respectful throughout the encounter. Richard recognized each sentence as another door quietly closing. Then the corporate attorney spoke. Mr. Collins, your employment agreement contains a morality clause requiring respectful treatment of customers, regardless of financial status. Based upon documented evidence, the board may terminate your employment immediately. Richard looked around the room. I'm not asking anyone to ignore what happened. His voice had lost all of its earlier confidence. I was wrong. The admission surprised several directors. I judged him by appearances. I embarrassed a little girl who had done absolutely nothing wrong. There isn't an excuse for that. He paused before continuing. If the board removes me, I'll accept it. Thomas studied him for a long moment. Do you understand what your greatest mistake was? Richard answered quietly. Thinking $5 determined a person's worth. Thomas nodded once. Exactly. The board voted unanimously. Richard Collins was removed as branch manager, effective immediately. His executive privileges were revoked before the meeting ended. Denise Carter was appointed interim manager pending further review. No applause followed. No celebration. Just quiet acceptance that accountability had taken its course. Before anyone left, Thomas made one final announcement. Beginning today, Willow Regional Bank will implement the Hale Customer Dignity Policy at every branch. The directors looked toward him. Every lawful customer transaction, regardless of amount, will receive equal respect. Annual empathy and service training will become mandatory for every employee, officer, and executive. Security personnel may never remove a customer who is acting peacefully without written documentation reviewed afterward by corporate compliance. Finally, every new employee will learn the history of this institution, including why no balance sheet is more valuable than human dignity. Every director voted in favor. Shortly after noon, Thomas and Daniel drove together to Hale Auto Repair. Marcus was beneath an aging pickup replacing a transmission mount when their car rolled into the lot. He slid out from underneath, wiped his hands with a shop towel, and smiled politely. Mr. Whitaker, Thomas returned the smile. Marcus. Emma looked up from a folding chair where she was finishing her summer reading assignment. She recognized neither man, but she noticed the respect with which they greeted her father. Daniel stepped forward. We owe you an apology. Marcus shook his head gently. You don't owe me one. Thomas answered softly. The institution does. Marcus looked toward the garage where another customer waited patiently. Has the board made its decision? Thomas nodded. Richard Collins is no longer branch manager. Marcus was silent. We've also approved permanent policy changes across every branch. Thomas handed Marcus a folder containing the signed resolutions. Marcus glanced through the documents before closing it. Good. Daniel looked surprised. That's all? Marcus smiled faintly. Removing one manager fixes one mistake. Changing the system prevents the next one. Thomas couldn't help smiling. Your grandfather used to say almost the same thing. Marcus looked toward Emma. She had been listening carefully. Come here, Bug. She walked over, still holding her book. Do you remember yesterday? Emma nodded. Yes. Do you remember what I told you? She thought for a moment. That people don't always know the whole story. Marcus smiled. That's right. He looked toward Thomas and Daniel. Sometimes they learn. Emma looked up at the two visitors. Is everything okay now? Thomas bent down until he was eye level with her. Because of your dad, it will be better than okay. Marcus quietly returned to work that afternoon. The engine still needed repairing. Customers still needed honest answers. Life did not suddenly become glamorous. The old pickup still rattled. The porch step at home still creaked. The bills still arrived every month. But something invisible had changed throughout Willow Creek. News of the incident spread quickly, Not because Marcus told anyone, but because witnesses couldn't stop talking about what they had seen. People remembered not the fortune he quietly possessed, but the calm with which he had accepted humiliation without surrendering his dignity. A week later, Richard Collins arrived at Hale Auto Repair, wearing plain clothes instead of tailored suits. He waited until Marcus finished with a customer. "Mr. Hale," Marcus turned. "Richard." Richard looked genuinely humbled. "I don't expect forgiveness. I only wanted to tell you that I was wrong." Marcus studied him for a moment, before extending his grease-stained hand. Richard looked at it, then shook it firmly. "Take care of the people you lead wherever you go next," Marcus said quietly. "I will." Richard nodded, turned, and walked away carrying no title, no office, and no illusion that respect could ever be measured by the size of a deposit. As autumn settled over Willow Creek, Emma and Marcus walked together past the bank one evening on their way home from getting ice cream. Through the front windows, they saw a new bronze plaque mounted beside the entrance. Emma stopped to read it aloud. "Every customer deserves dignity. Every person deserves respect. Character is measured by conduct, never by appearance." She smiled up at her father. "Did Grandpa write that?" Marcus laughed softly. "Close enough." Emma slipped her hand into his. "I think Mom would have liked it." Marcus looked toward the evening sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. "I think she would have too." He squeezed Emma's hand gently, and together they continued home, knowing that real wealth had never been hidden inside vaults or counted on balance sheets. It had always been found in the quiet strength to treat every person with the respect they deserved, even when no one believed you had anything left to give. If this story reminded you that true worth is revealed by character rather than circumstance, subscribe and turn on notifications now for more stories that prove dignity is never determined by the size of a person's bank account.